Broadcasting the information the mainstream media won't touch. This is The Richie Allen Show in association with DavidIke.com.
Jill Dando was the 1997 BBC Personality of the Year. She was a journalist. She was a terrific journalist. She died on the 26th of April 1999. It's only a few days, obviously, to her anniversary. When she did die, she was presenting a very famous BBC programme called Crime Watch. On the day she died, she was returning home to her apartment and she was shot once in the head by an unknown assailant. A man called Barry George was later convicted in jail for her murder, but when he appealed, he was acquitted. He didn't do it, basically. The case remains open. They say they don't know what happened to Jill Dando. What is very interesting about her death and about the subsequent investigation of it and the media coverage of it is that back in July of 2014, the Daily Star on Sunday claimed that Jill Dando had been investigating a paedophile ring at the BBC during the mid-90s. And in fact, she'd gone as far as to hand a dossier on it to BBC management. The Star on Sunday at the time implied very, very strongly this may have prompted a revenge attack. The BBC maintains to this day that it had seen no evidence to support that claim. But there are many people working in the independent media who don't believe that. Let's welcome our first guest to the programme. I like him a lot. I like people who write, who talk, who challenge, who make films about the sorts of things you don't hear on mainstream television and radio. He is the founder and editor of the alternative media website Breaking Down the News, or BDTN, breakingdownthenews.blogspot.co.uk. He's just about to release, or he has just released, a documentary film about Jill Dando called Justice for Jill, looking into her suspicious death. Let's welcome him to the programme. Steve Murray joins us. Steve, how are you? You're very welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks for having me on.
Not at all. Thanks for getting in touch, and thanks for making the film, Steve. It's a fantastic film. What we've seen of it, we've seen two parts of it, of course. You'll tell all the listeners where they can see it and where they can view it in the coming days. We're approaching the anniversary, as I said. Why this particular story, Steve? What was it that drew you to this story, her story, her as a character, and the suspicions around her death?
Well, when I was a child, I remember coming home from school at dinner time and seeing on the news. It was only a year after, a couple of years after Diana's death. And then I seen on the news, breaking news, and I said to my mum, what's happened now? And she said, Jill Dando, the TV journalist, has been murdered. So at the time, I thought something was a bit strange about that, but I was only a little kid. So anyway, as the years went on and more stuff came out about child abuse at the BBC and Westminster and everywhere else, Elm Guest House, etc., I started getting more interested into it. So I started looking more into it. Started with me looking more into the child abuse for like Jimmy Savile, Elm Guest House, etc., and obviously Cliff Richard as well. And then as I was joining dots with connections to Jill Dando, connections to Jimmy Savile and Cliff Richard and stuff, Jill Dando kept
Can I just jump in there very quickly already? I'm just going to say this because it's important, and I know you know this as well. While Cliff Richard's house has been searched by the police in the past, he hasn't been charged with anything. And he hasn't been convicted of anything, and he remains innocent until proven guilty of anything. So we must just say that. A lot of things are said in the independent media about Cliff Richard, which are irresponsible, because the man hasn't been charged or tried for anything. His house has been searched, but a lot of people's houses have been searched for a lot of things. So I just want to say that. I'm not admonishing you, my good friend. I'm just saying that for the listener. Yeah, exactly. So she died. Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead, my friend.
But his name pops up every time, and his name is on the Elm Guest House list. But I see where you're coming from.
And that's an interesting one, Steve, because when you look at, the Elm House, guest list, for want of a better word, when you look at Dolphin Square, and what was going on, so many and I don't want to name them. I don't want to name them simply because they haven't been charged with anything. Some of them will be very litigious, and I don't have any money, and I don't want to be sued by any of these people, right? And I'm guessing you working in the independent media, my friend, you don't have any money either.
No.
Right? But some of our broadcast partners might have money, so we got to worry about them.
Yeah.
So a lot of names come up around Dolphin Square in Elmhouse. You remembered her dying as a kid. It was a big deal when she was shot. All the Savile revelations came out. And then The Star on Sunday did the big piece, which was famous in 2014, about what she was investigating. Now, tell us about your investigation into this story that she was, in fact, in possession of a dossier. Get into this, Steve, because this is serious. Because a lot of people say, it's only rumour. A lot of people say, no, it isn't. Now, I lean towards you, my friend. I lean towards that she did know what was going on at the BBC, and she was looking into it because she had a track record of that sort of journalism. Tell me how you got into it and into what she was looking into.
Well, I came across the Daily Star stuff. I didn't start doing it because of the Daily Star, looking into it, investigating it. I came across the Daily Star as I was looking into it, investigating child abuse, so that came a bit later, but it was afterwards, like joining all the dots and stuff about child abuse and Jill Dando and other people that surrounded Jill Dando. I came across something about another BBC journalist called Sally Jones, who was a good friend of Jill Dando. And it was her that said that Jill was looking into child abuse at the BBC. And it was her that said she handed in stuff to the BBC bosses and also police as well about child abuse at the BBC.
And Sally was working at the BBC, wasn't she?
Yeah, she was a journalist there.
She was a journalist there, yeah. Now, we got to ask these questions, of course, not of you, but of Sally. Do we trust Sally Jones? I mean, often people leave organisations and they leave them, in a bad way. They fall out with people. There were problems. Is Sally? You've looked into her. You've talked about her. You've spoken to her. Is she credible, Steve?
I'd say she's credible. Yeah, she seems to be, what's the word? She seems to know what she's saying, if you know what I mean. She doesn't seem like she's lying.
She doesn't seem like she's any axe to grind with anybody.
No.
So she said then that working with Jill Dando, she knew for a fact that Jill had gone to BBC bosses and had handed in this dossier to the BBC. Now, people listening to this and who don't know this story, they'll be asking, did she copy the dossier and give it to the police, Steve?
It's apparently it went missing a few months. It was I think it was not Clarence Mitchell, sorry. I forgot his name now. Hamish Campbell looking into it, and apparently when it all came out about Jimmy Savile and the rest and all the child abuse at Elm Guesthouse in Westminster and everything, it went missing from the police files. The BBC have always said and still said to this day that she never came to them, but Sally Jones says otherwise.
She says otherwise. Is there anybody else who corroborates that story, Steve? Is there anybody else who knew Jill who says, yes, I know that she was indeed looking into this and I know that she did have this dossier?
Well, we spoke to someone the other day and he doesn't want to be named, but he was telling us that when he worked at the BBC, he wasn't a celebrity or he wasn't anyone high up or anything. He was just working for the BBC, and he said that Jill Dando, at the time when he was working there and she was working there, he knew of rumours about Jill Dando investigating this stuff, and he also knew of rumours about that Cliff Richard was trying his best to befriend Jill, and he said it seemed a bit too strange at the time, but he said he never thought nothing of it at the time, but when all this came out, he said when he looked back, it seemed strange.
She was so incredibly high profile
Yes, she was, yeah.
For our American listeners and our listeners maybe in other parts of the world. It's important to note that this was a very high profile BBC presenter. She was a young woman She was obviously incredibly bright. She was a terrific presenter. She had a track record of, you know, in her career of going after scandals, going after people. I've been asked to ask you, Steve, loads of tweets on this, loads of people interested in it. John is listening to it and he says, ask Steve what his view is on the guy who did time for it. Now, we're talking about Barry George. Tell us as much as you know, Steve, about Barry George and how he ended up getting convicted.
From what I've researched, it just seemed that he was picked on for being, I don't want to sound nasty, but he was picked on for being a bit of a loner and a bit of a weirdo. And it seemed like an easy escape for Hamish Campbell and other police officers to pick someone up and blame them for it, because they didn't. When the case first came out, that Hamish Campbell was only joining the case 7 months into it because nothing was going on and no one was being arrested, and yeah, loads of people could have rang up and said things about who did it, but no one said nothing, and they were asking people everywhere and no one was replying to them. So they changed the SIO, which is to Hamish Campbell, and then once he's took over the case, he zoomed in on Barry George and started to pick on him, especially because he was a loner and because he was a loner and a bit of a weirdo, and he was known around that area as that. Don't offend him if
not at all. No. Well, Barry has to accept Barry George, whether he likes it or not, that women had reported him of stalking before and of antisocial behaviour. Of course, that doesn't mean that he murdered anybody, and of course he didn't. He did not murder Jill Dando, but he was a loner. He was an easy target. You make a great point too, Steve, because they spoke to nearly 3,000 people. Yeah. They took 1,500 statements, and it was almost out of. I mean, I can only guess. I've covered murders over the years at different points in my career. They were desperately embarrassed that such a high-profile woman, such a personality, had been murdered. They were probably mortified, and the pressure was unbelievable to bring somebody in. And as you quite rightly said, here was good old Barry George, bit of an Egypt, we'd say in Ireland, bit of an Egypt, and bit of an idiot, and bang, he's in prison. He was convicted, but the conviction was quashed, and he had a second trial which only lasted a couple of months, and he was acquitted back in 2008. What a story this is, if indeed Jill Dando's basically looking into child sex abuse, and that child sex abuse going to the highest corridors of the government and the BBC, if that prompted somebody to say she had to go, what a story that is. Look, I'll read a few tweets, Steve, because there's so many of them coming in. It's 23 minutes to the top of the hour. I'm with Steve Murray, by the way. Steve, his website where you can find Breaking Down the News is breakingdownthenews.blogspot.co.uk. Steve founded and edited that alternative media website. He's made documentaries and films in the past. He's produced Justice for Jill, which is brand new, a documentary that looks into Jill Dando's death, and we'll get from Steve all the links and all the info you need on that to watch it. Because what I've seen of it, and I've seen 2 parts of it, and it's very good, it's very well put together, and it's very interesting. Let me read a few of these. Let's see. Let's scroll right down there. John was on to say, I've always believed that Jill Dando's death was suspicious. It was a professional hit that the person who did it didn't leave a single trace, says John. That's a very good point. Alan was on to ask the question. I just lost that there now for a second. Alan was on to ask the question. I've always wondered about this. Did she give a copy of the dossier to the police, the same dossier that she gave to the BBC? We touched on that, Steve. It seems that she did give the information she had to the police as well. Do we believe that?
Yeah, I believe that, yeah.
And the police have basically said nothing to the effect that they had it or they lost it. They just haven't acknowledged it.
Yeah, well, the police had it, and then as soon as Hamish Campbell took over the case, it just went missing.
So have the police at some stage said, yes, we did receive a report from Jill Dando?
They haven't actually admitted to it, but they did slip up once by saying that it went missing, and then that's as soon as Hamish Campbell took over. So they never actually admitted to having it, but they slipped up about it being lost.
Here's a tweet from Site Restored on Twitter. He says Alison Saunders, who now obviously heads up the Crown Prosecution Service, she runs it. She was involved in charging Barry George. I didn't know that. Did you know that? That she had links to the prosecution of Barry George?
She had links to Hamish Campbell and the other police officers that were involved, but it wasn't actually her personally that charged them. But she was in charge of, she was the head of the courts and stuff at the time of it happening, and she still is, I think, today.
Do you know what's really interesting about the deaths of Jill Dando? And when I was, thinking about this today, knowing you were coming on, Steve, she was murdered in 1999, of course. We reckon that she gave the BBC the information. What year was it that she gave the BBC the information? 97, was it?
No, it was a bit later than that. I think it was around the end of 98 and early 99, so it wasn't for long before she was actually murdered.
Right, because the reason I'm asking that is because the BBC ran a documentary in 1997, and in that documentary, Tim Fortescue, who was the chief whip of the Conservative Party under Edward Heath, Fortescue said that it was a very common thing in the early 1970s for politicians, MPs, to come to the whips to say, oh, we're in trouble here because we've been abusing boys and the old bill are knocking on the door. And Tim Fortescue told the BBC that basically the whips made those allegations go away. So the BBC knew a lot, didn't they, really, when you think about it, Steve?
I think the BBC was originally set up as a propaganda machine for the royals and the government anyway, so I think they know a lot more than what they're letting on about everything, not just Jill Dando, but the child abuse, Jimmy Savile, everything. I think they're just a mouthpiece for the government and the royals.
Do you know what I was thinking a few weeks back when the BBC's own report into the Savile behaviour came out? It was inevitable. We knew, you and I and others, we knew that it was inevitable that the BBC's report would absolve the top bosses of any knowledge.
Yeah.
And it actually said that, while rumours might have been flying around, the BBC basically said what Terry Wogan said. Wogan said that, you heard things from time to time, but, people didn't like one another. There was jealousy. There was a lot of Chinese whispers going on. But the idea that the BBC bosses didn't know what Savile was doing, Steve, you don't buy that for a minute.
No, of course they knew. Of course they knew it was happening. If all the not all the BBC staff, but if some of the BBC staff and journalists and even celebrities knew what Savile was doing, like Terry Wogan, for example, then of course the BBC bosses knew what he was up to.
I want to ask you about Jill's partner, her fiance. Tell us about him and tell us how relevant he is to what was going on. What did he know?
Well, he's a doctor, and he was set up on a blind date by Cliff Richard because, first of all, Cliff Richard, as I was mentioning earlier, that someone who wanted to stay anonymous was saying that Cliff Richard was trying to get in with Jill Dando, and she was always too busy to be involved or even become friendly with him. So the BBC set up a documentary to send Jill Dando to Vienna, and they told her she was going to meet a prince, and this prince turned out to be Cliff Richard, so they surprised her. So Cliff finally got to meet Jill Dando. And
what
Jill
year
Dando,
was this, Steve? What year was this now?
I'm not sure what year it was. It was not long before Jill's death, though, so it must have been around 98. Yeah, probably around 97, 98. And so the BBC set Jill Dando up for a secret date with Cliff Richard, and she was made up because she was a Cliff Richard fan. She was a massive fan of Cliff Richard. And as the weeks went on anyway, Cliff Richard set her up on a blind date with a friend of his, which turned out to be Alan Farthing, which to me seems a bit dodgy.
He was her partner, her fiancé at the time of her death.
Yeah. So, but Cliff Richard set them up on a blind date, and then they ended up getting together. And then he was with her, and they got engaged about a month and a half, 2 months before she was shot dead. And he was the only person that knew that day where Jill was going, because the house she was shot outside of was her old home in Fulham, and she only told him she was going back there because it was very rare for her to go back to the house because it was being sold off. So she only went back every now and then, and she told Alan Farthing she was going back to her Fulham home that day, and no one else knew she was going there, and that's when she was shot outside the home.
Now, he was a gynaecologist, and you're saying that she was sent off to interview a prince by the BBC in 1997. Yeah. Unknown to her, it was actually Cliff Richard.
Yeah, and the prince never even existed.
The prince never existed. So she was a big fan of Cliff. Now, Steve, look, I'm not an idiot, and I don't want to sound like an idiot, but I'm just going to be the devil's advocate for a minute here now.
Okay.
Supposing producers at the BBC knew how much she was crazy about Cliff Richard and his music, it's not beyond the bounds of possibility that somebody at the BBC might say, well, we love Jill, she's our colleague, let's do her a big favour, let's send her off on this goose chase, this assignment, but at the end of it, it'll be Cliff Richard. I'm just saying that, could that not be a possibility?
Yeah, but why send her all the way to Italy to do it?
Yeah,
it just seems a bit far-fetched and a bit...
And you know what's interesting, Steve? The official account of how they met, her and Alan Farthing, the gynaecologist, doesn't mention Cliff Richard. It says that a mutual friend introduced them.
Yeah, it was Cliff Richard that introduced them because Cliff Richard and Alan Farthing have known each other for a long time. I'm not sure how they met themselves, but I know they were good friends through other celebrities as well. At the top, I can't think at the top of my head what celebrities they were, but I know they were linked that way, and he then set Jill up with the surprise date, and then that's when they got together.
Let's do a quick recap, Steve. This is important stuff, my friend. Steve Murray is on the line, folks. It's 15 minutes to the top of the hour. Have a listen. We're talking about Jill Dando. She died in 1999, 26th of April 1999. She was murdered, shot in the head outside an apartment in London. Now, it's alleged that, and Steve believes this, and it's the subject of his documentary, Justice for Jill, it's alleged that she knew a lot about paedophilia at the BBC and elsewhere, that she gave a dossier of information to the police and to the BBC, naming very high-profile people in society and people who worked for the BBC. Cliff Richard comes into this. Now, Cliff Richard is innocent until proven guilty. He hasn't been charged or convicted with anything. However, we know that Cliff has been accused of things. We know this because his house has been searched. Now, a lot of people are accused of things that they didn't do. Like I said, he's innocent until proven guilty. But what's really interesting about this, two things, as Steve has just said there. She was very interested in him. She was sent off to Italy to interview a prince. Turned out to be Cliff Richard. Bizarre behaviour by the BBC, if this is true. Richard was the guy who introduced her to her partner, the man whom she was engaged to marry up until her death, a guy called Alan Farthing. He's a gynaecologist. So it all gets curiouser and curiouser, to quote Lewis Carroll. Now, what's really interesting here, Steve, is I've been told by my brilliant producer, Claire Calvey, something I did not know, despite the research I did for this, and that is that this guy, Alan Farthing, was the gynaecologist to the future Queen of England.
Yeah, and the actual Queen as well. He was, not long after Jill's death, he was promoted to top doctor of the royal family, and he was the gynaecologist for the Queen. And plus, he was at the birth of both Kate's babies, George, and I can't remember the princess's name.
So her, George and Charlotte, I believe. I'm a closet royalist. I just put on this conspiracy stuff for fun. I love the royals. I was outside with a Union Jack flag today, waving it around. I was in my arse. But let me tell you, right? So tell us why it isn't a coincidence that this guy gets promoted to be the royal gynaecologist.
It just seems so...
Did he have any royal connections before that? While she was alive, did he move in their circles? Was he a friend of any of them? Did he know any of these people?
I think he was a friend of people like Leon Britton, and he was a friend of... what's his name? He was a friend of like...
Don't say Greville Janner.
Oh no, he wasn't a friend of him, but he was a friend of Esther Ranson as well. He'd known Esther Ranson for quite a few years. But like I said, he was friends with Cliff Richard. He knew Leon Britton, and he did have I don't know what the links were, but he did have links with the royal family. But as soon as Jill was, well, not as soon as, but not long after Jill Dando's death, he was promoted to top royal doctor for the royal household.
Susie is listening to this in New Zealand, and we've had a lot of positive tweets there. James was on to say he's now promoted to the Royal Paediatric Doctor. Loads of people saying they're looking forward to see the film. Martin Houston was on to say BBC is supposed to be full of journalists. How come more of them did not twig that the pedos were in their midst? But Susie in New Zealand, she's not buying any of this at all, Steve. Susie says, sorry, but Steve is drawing too many long straws. Where's the actual evidence? It is a lot of circumstantial evidence, I suppose. But the problem Steve has, Susie in New Zealand, and I have, and everybody else has, when those who are in the know are not questioned under caution, are not questioned in the presence of a solicitor, these questions, which I think are very fair questions that Steve is asking, they're not going to be answered unless these people are questioned. I mean, I mentioned Prince Charles earlier on. He is the avowed best friend of Jimmy Savile.
Yeah.
Years, decades, close friends, these guys. How could he not know what Savile was up to? You know, now Prince Charles, of course, is not accused of anything. I'm not accusing him of anything. Not at all. That would be irresponsible journalism. But as a policeman, I would like to speak with him.
See, that's how I've done this film. If I was a policeman, I've done it from a policeman's point of view. So I've connected the dots. It took years of research. I've connected dots to each different people, and it goes further than just. It's just a conspiracy theory about Jill Dando being shot dead because she reported on child abuse. Once you see the film, it connects all the dots, like the police who were involved, royals who were involved, politicians who were involved, politicians who covered things up, who have now died, or even some who were still alive. The whole film connects the dots. So
there's been a few mysterious deaths, Steve, has there, over the last years? People whom were connected,
God, yeah.
Right?
There's been God, I can't think of his name. So there's even people like, I know it's going to sound over the top, but people like Rick Mail. Rick Mail was fine. He was healthy. He was fit. Or all of a sudden, he started. I know this has got nothing to do with Jill Dando, but he started talking about the Twin Towers and 9/11 and stuff. And then all of a sudden, he's had this complication with his heart and he's died. And his wife said on the day of his death, well, at least we know it's not his heart, because we've just been told his heart's fine. And then the media was saying he'd had a heart attack or whatever. So it seems to me that anyone who speaks out against the BBC or accuses the BBC of things end up 6 foot under.
Well, I tell you what, Steve, you know, I grew up watching The Young Ones and Bottom with Rick Mail and Ed Edmondson, and I would say this, my friend, anybody who worked within the BBC during the time that Savile was doing what he was doing, and I might have heard one or two things, anybody like that who dies, you know, young, or who dies very young, or who dies in kind of strange circumstances, I'm very much like you. I'm very interested in that. Of course, Rick Mail had a lot to do with the BBC over the years as well, and I would be very interested in that, yeah.
Rick Mail did and the cast of The Young Ones actually did a single with Cliff Richard, and in 2007 Rick Mail had said Cliff Richard's not the Christian you think he is.
How interesting. We're getting a lot of questions about Mr. Farthing.
Right.
A lot of questions about him and about his participation in the investigation. When somebody dies, they're shot in the head. Now, I would imagine if my fiancée, Caroline, was to be shot on the doorstep of our house tomorrow, heaven forbid, I would be immediately fingered as somebody of grave importance for the investigation. Was this guy considered a suspect by the police, Alan Farthing, this gynecologist guy? Was he questioned? Was he considered, you know, a serious person of interest? Or was he just discarded as somebody who couldn't have done it from the word go?
Yeah, I don't think he was ever officially questioned. I think he was obviously questioned by the police, but I don't think he was officially questioned. It just seemed to be that he was just this partner of Jill, and this sad things happened to him, and he's upset, and he's not. he's gutted about it and whatever. So I don't think he was officially questioned over it at all.
You've blown away a lot of our listeners because many of them, including myself, did not know that Cliff Richard introduced Farthing and Jill Dando.
Yeah.
Can I just put this to you, Steve? Again, kind of semi being the devil's advocate, but I want to kind of be a little bit tough on you as well. Do we know this for an absolute fact that that he introduced them? Where's the definitive evidence on that?
Well, I can't say it's 100% fact, but see, I don't want to give too much of the film away.
No, I do appreciate that, and we're going to plug the bejesus out of it now in a second, so don't worry about that either. But you're telling us that in the film there's strong evidence to suggest that he was the man who introduced them.
There's links to show you how they met and how he did it.
Well, I tell you what, my friend, I'm going to plug the website. Go to breakingdownthenews.blogspot.co.uk. Steve, just before we run out of time, tell us and tell our listeners where they can see the film, the finished article. When is it going to be ready for people?
It's going to be out on the 26th of April, which is the anniversary of Jill Dando's death. It won't be on YouTube because it's been banned. I'd set up...
It's been pre-banned, has it?
Yeah, I had a pre-edit of it on YouTube and it got banned straight away. So I've had to upload it into 3 parts. Instead of a full film, it's going to be into 3 parts now. And it's going to be available on Vimeo. And also it'll be available on the BDTN website. And at the top of the website, there's a button saying Justice for Jill, and it's just you can just click on that, and it'll be available there.
And it's free to watch to people, is it?
Oh, 100% free.
That's magnificent. When it's ready to go, my friend, we will share it all over the place. I'll get David to link to it as well on social media, and I have no doubt tens of thousands of people, if not more, are going to watch it. It's called Justice for Jill. Thanks for coming on and telling us about it, Steve. And continued success to you, mate. Not at all. And again, folks, go to breakingdownthenews.blogspot.co.uk. Serious stuff there. Steve, come back and talk to us again, my friend. A pleasure.
Definitely.
Bye for now. Steve Murray on the line to us there from Liverpool